Welcome to the IT Matters Podcast, where we explore why IT matters and matters pertaining to IT.
Welcome, everyone, to the IT Matters Podcast, where we crack into the minds of the brightest IT leaders and discuss the challenges facing us today so we can stay sharp and guide our organizations to a brighter digital future. I'm your host, Keith Hawkey, a technology advisor, and some might say IT whisperer. But enough about me. Today, we're discussing security compliance with the VP of IT and Security of Cohere Health, a software startup in the healthcare space. Cohere is actually the winner of the Triple T and has been named both Healthcare's Fierce 15 and CB Insights Digital Health 150 list, as well as ranked on LinkedIn's top startups. And today we have Darrell Stinson. He leads Cohere's IT and security, and he knows a thing or two about building security compliance plans for startups, as he successfully implemented at many young companies across the past decade. Darrell, welcome to the IT Matters Podcast. How are you doing, brother?
I am doing great, Keith. Thank you for that very warm and eloquent welcome.
Anytime you have a call, just give me a ring. I'll type something up real fast and put a smile behind it.
Thanks so much.
Be happy to offer my services there. So, Darrell, today we're really focusing on cybersecurity compliance. And one of the reasons I thought that you would make a great guest to have on is your background, particularly with startups and how you've been able to, startups typically don't have the most resources and prior knowledge to adhere to some of the, probably more prevalent today is the cloud-focused compliance that startups mostly operate in since they are starting a new company, and getting into the data center game is less attractive as it was before. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you end up in the position you're in? A little bit about your career and how you got to where you are today?
Certainly. My start was actually in the U.S. Army. So military information systems security. That was my job in the military. I ensured that conversations or data that was supposed to remain secret, most things that had a computer chip in it, was trained to repair those items. That's where I got my start. That's where my foundation was built, from the compliance space to encryption, algorithms and rotations, all those types of things that we utilize today in the cloud and SaaS and platform as a service, data center technology. And this was over 20 years ago.
I know that IT or technology in the Army is a little bit of a different beast than it is in the private world. How did you get involved in startups? I know that you're based out of Atlanta, and there's an active group of startup companies and a little bit of an incubator city. How did you land in kind of so many startup companies? And can you tell us a little bit about your path there?
Sure, man. So after my time in the military, I did work as a Department of Defense contractor. So I did things like teach binary math to soldiers who were joining the military, networking and switching and all those things. This was in Augusta, Georgia, at a base formerly known as Fort Gordon. It's called Fort Eisenhower, just recently went through a name change. But looking at the Metro Atlanta area, yeah, you're right. There is a huge community here. We're so interconnected. It feels like there's only 50 of us. Everyone knows everyone. But lots of startups and younger companies call Atlanta home for many different reasons, right? But my security engineering job was with a startup, and it was in the healthcare space. And I was exposed to things that I had never actually seen in the private sector. Things like auditing on the SOC side, Sarbanes-Oxley, writing policies from scratch and implementing firewalls. Virtual desktop infrastructure technology. I thought it was fascinating, just the level of resilience. So that's where I cut my teeth on building things from scratch. So staffing teams and figuring out the right people to hire, what tools are good. Sometimes you won't always have the right resources or funds at startup to just throw money at any need or solution. So you have to be resourceful. You have to be decisive and that's one of the things that I love about startup. You get to solve current problems with current technology and current willing and able bodies, right? I just love formulating these teams and creating these solutions that really take, startups to the championship. I call it the promised land.
Yeah, something stuck out to me. You mentioned there's a lot of grand ambitions of startups, but you often have very limited resources because they are focused on the monthly cost. And I've worked with a handful of startups, and that's a primary concern. Vast majority of services today, cybersecurity services today, have a monthly cost to it or an annual cost. So everything is moving to the subscription model. So you have to be extremely resourceful when you are taking on this challenge. Is it safe to say that you may have experimented with some open source technology? Have you ever had any experience with open source?
Absolutely. So open source is probably one of the first areas that companies that don't have unlimited resources would go to. What can I utilize that doesn't cost me either anything or a lot of money that still helps me solve my problem or address the need? So open source tools are very useful at times, but sometimes you can find yourself limited for certain reasons where you need to step up your game and maybe subscribe to a particular tool on a monthly expense or maybe the annual expense. And this all comes with maturity of growing companies, right? I've been in all different spaces. So financial technology, healthcare, data center. I mentioned, military operations before, but getting exposed to a number of different types of domains and industries has really helped me put together my repertoire of solutions that I can go to and lean on when it comes to maybe I have something that's similar. Maybe it'll help us in this particular stage.
Yeah, cross-pollinating, especially in the technology space, is so vital today with the rapid pace that an IT leader has to keep up with. So let's dive into some of the frameworks, some of the strategies that you've implemented when you walk into a new company, new startup, software space. What do you typically find as far as the ecosystem, and how do you go about starting that process of what are we complying to? What are my resources? How do you start your methodology?
That's a good question. So I love when I have the opportunity to utilize auditing, right? Or some sort of reference point, for instance, in the healthcare space. So we have high trust, HIPAA, that gives us guidelines or reference points on what we should be doing or need to adhere to. But there are other frameworks that many of us can use, almost any company and at any phase or any level of maturity. And it's the 5 elements of a cybersecurity framework. Those 5 elements do go in order. So it's identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And then I'll kind of talk a little bit about each of those and why they're important for their own reasons. So identify is the main question that you ask me, right? You want to identify what's at stake, what business you're in, what type of staff do you have, what type of correspondence, documentation, policies do you already have on hand? Maybe you have none. Maybe you have some, or maybe it's elaborate. But you also want to identify physical and digital assets. We talked about ecosystem. Most companies they have some sort of it, whether it's a hybrid remote work setup or like Cohere, remote first, and folks are all over the country, right? So that identification piece is really important because you need to know what you're defending, what you need to protect, what's at stake, what's critical, what's not. And through that discovery, you'll probably find that you have some blind spots too. So leaning into the next element of this, which is protect. So you wouldn't defend a $10,000 asset with $500,000, for instance, right? So
yeah, I'd love to get into that a little more because what you're talking about is very persuasive when you're trying to illustrate the numbers to the decision makers of the business.
Absolutely.
It's one thing to say that we have secured these elements of our business. We have protections in place. We have these layers, but it's far more persuasive in my experience to describe the value of the assets they have and then compare those to the security tools and the cost associated with those to protect those assets. Do you have any specific examples of of drawing that comparison. How do you value data, value various assets within a company?
So someone like myself won't usually dictate that to the business, right? And we encourage, and this is where the collaborative effort is really, really important, because you can't do IT or security alone. But what I usually encourage the business to do is understand the value of the assets. If we're talking about HIPAA data, right? What is the cost of a breach? There are some reference points there, right? What is the cost of a breach? What are some of the fines or penalties that we may be held against, right? Maybe you're in the banking industry. There are reference points out there that can give you dollar amounts. And then maybe some of those investigative efforts or forensic efforts that it might be required to investigate, or you might have to devote to it. If you understand some of these numbers, and I've often partnered with firms that come in and do a benchmark assessment, it can help you decide exactly, hey, it would cost you this amount of money based on the amount of data that you have, or the types of resources that you have. If you experience a breach and the industry that you're in, if you experience a breach, it would probably cost you this amount of money. And here's your level of maturity to defend against it. This is one of the first things I like to do at a new organization. Sometimes it's a little pricey, but the amount of visibility that you get in understanding your maturity and what it may cost you or may not cost you, so that you can have the right kind of conversation about what we're spending and how we're investing in the program. But a lot of it, Keith, is analogies. Right? So once we understand some of these reference points, we don't want to spend, $1.2 million on, investing in a breach and paying out in fines. So it makes sense to spend maybe $250,000 on this particular resource that helps us carve out supply chain and vendor partnerships. And maybe we create a hybrid team that allows us to have staff on hand and vendors in like a 24/7 type of scenario. There are lots of companies or vendors who offer SOC as a service or managed detection and response. And a lot of companies think that, well, if you hire a couple of good security people, you're probably covered if something goes wrong. And that couldn't be farther from the truth, right? What I like to do is create maybe a hybrid scenario. So one of these SOC as a service teams, think of it like an ER team. So someone comes into the ER and you have someone who's checking blood pressure, someone who's doing maybe chest compressions, and someone who's dressing a wound. But everyone does something, right? And in this SOC as a service piece, that's what companies want as assurance. So put a price tag on that and you say, well, we could spend X amount of dollars, whether it's $100,000 or $200,000 on this, and we have coverage, we have assurance. Something happens at 3 a.m. or Christmas Eve, we have a team or a solution in place. And that kind of helps paint the picture to either the board or executive leadership teams who need to make decisions on where money's spent.
Sounds like you've had to evaluate a handful of those SOC as a service MDR providers.
Yes, I have, and had some implemented before. And that's not the only type of solution, but there's so many different scenarios. And I think analogies have really, really helped me articulate or communicate to folks who don't have the depth and understanding in the IT and security space, but still need to know enough to make decisions. So that's kind of been one of my secret weapons.
There are, seems like, hundreds of SOC as a service providers today. And every MSP seems to be adding them to their list of services. There are names popping up doing it differently. Some of them are using SIEM, some are not. Some of them will simply rely on REST APIs into existing infrastructure and ecosystems. How do you kind of sniff out what MDR providers are worth the value compared to some that might be cutting corners, right? Because that's a common issue when you have maybe a newer IT leader that's confronted with everyone saying the same thing on, with demos and calls. Have you learned any tactics to ask their MDR provider to see how they compare to some of the better ones in the market?
Oh my goodness. So it's not just SOC as a service or MDR. This works for almost any solution that's new to the business, or one maybe you're not so familiar with. I call them science projects, but it's a proof of concept, right? So you need to hold a proof of concept. Maybe there's a problem statement, or here's the gap that we have today, right? And maybe it's not so clear in the beginning, but you have a pretty good idea. And then you develop success criteria. The ideal solution would give us 24/7 coverage. It would give us coaching in the event that we needed. It would give us forensics or investigation in the event that we needed. It would give us triage of alerts and events that are happening at all times of day, all across the business and our infrastructure. You figure out what that criteria is, right? And then you invite stakeholders. So you shouldn't make this decision or do this science project or POC in a vacuum. So if you have security engineers and they hold a conduct a proof of concept, maybe a week or two, maybe it's a month, but they run through the concept and then no one else has been invited. So platform hasn't had a chance to look at it. Engineering hasn't had a chance to look at it. Other folks who may be impacted by the alerts or invited to an incident, something happens, they haven't had a chance to weigh in. I invite everyone I can invite to the party so they can ask questions. They can maybe add to success criteria. And then you deliver this or take this to the vendor or the candidates. Maybe you have 3, maybe you have 5. You need at least 2. I suggest 3. You kind of boil it down and then you compare them across that success criteria. Maybe it's price, maybe it's speed, maybe it's ease of use or usability rather, right? And you figure out what's most important to you as a leader for the team, but then that really benefits and provides assurance to the business. Once you do this, you will discover, hey, this actually doesn't perform the way they promised, or maybe it does more than what they promised. They have different things like Slack integrations, and you can get notifications more quickly. This proof of concept, you should do it for every new solution. It should almost never be done in a vacuum. And also that communication piece of it helps build your credibility, help build your buy-in, and people are more inclined to support decisions that you make. So that is my cheat code, not just for SOC as a service or NDR solutions, but almost every spin that I take to the business.
Yeah, and it's a great way to identify potential gaps because often we're on demos and we hear something and we comprehend those words in a particular manner. But when it comes to having to manage the solution, it's an entirely different experience. And even on a demo, if you're on 4 or 5 demos a day, if this is your 7th meeting, if you're on back-to-backs and you're trying to pay attention and comprehend brand new technology, you're likely to miss aspects of the service, especially for something as important as the eyes that are going to watch over your data and make sure that your organization is secure.
Absolutely. One of the things that's really big about the proof of concept is at the end, I have partnered with vendors before I take the price tag to the business. Maybe I boil it down to 1 or 2. We work together on a deck, and a really good partner will work with you on the content of that deck. Maybe put one together based on your particular use case and implementation, things that work right for you. When you're talking about SOC as a service in particular, you're also talking about scaling a team. And a startup cannot hire 20 people in one department in 1 month, especially in security. So they will carve out what it costs to bring in a SOC analyst and how much work they would do, how many of them you might need, turn it into a dollar amount, and then the business can make really solid, informed decisions. It makes sense to close this gap with this particular partner. And yeah, you're right. There's like 100,000 different vendors in every single space of technology today, especially security. Trying to sniff all of them out is really hard to do. You don't have enough time to meet with them all, and your business partners internally don't have enough time to review them and give you buy-in. The proof of concept kind of accelerates the decision making, clears the smoke and mirrors, and it gives you a level of peace of mind too in saying that I lean on this, I believe in it, it's the right thing for us, and then here's why.
Yeah, and I could see how there are very specific challenges in the startup space, considering a vast majority of your data is stored in a SaaS application. Potentially, maybe you're leveraging Azure or AWS, potentially GCP or another IaaS cloud solution. A lot of your infrastructure is housed in some sort of co-managed situation, made servicing customers with large cloud environments the primary offering. And with that, from an architectural standpoint in mind, it sounds like sussing that out early, especially when you're with a newer company with a lot, it's focused on the cloud, is important. There are on occasion providers in the space that have been around for a while. They're good at what they do, but some of the cloud integrations can be limited because they're having to retool and they're having to hire new resources to manage the cloud space, to manage that service.
Right.
What are some of the strategies that, when you are having to adhere to like SOC 2, Type 2 compliance, what are some of the compliance requirements that you've had to adopt and get a startup in line to in your career? And do you have any words of advice and maybe things that you've learned during that journey?
So I've done about 25 audits in the last decade. So the range is from ISO 27001, ISO 27017 and 18, SOC 1 and 2, Type 2, Sarbanes-Oxley. I've done multiple of these at the different startups, right? And so when I say championships and promised land, this is usually what I have in mind when I join these younger companies, is to bring them to a position or posture that is comparable to either competitors or other players in the space that provides or establishes a level of assurance. But the benefit for folks like me is exactly what you mentioned, is those guardrails. I use the frameworks to tell the business the direction that we should go. So here's our azimuth, here's our North Star, whether it's high trust or SOC or ISO or NIST. We pick these frameworks together. Maybe it's required of the business. Maybe it's driven by contractual requirements. We can't sign these customers unless we achieve ISO by this date or maintain high trust. When you sift through those controls and those frameworks, they've ranged from 114 controls in an ISO audit to upwards of 280 in a high trust audit, right? Which I've done about 7 high trust audits as well. I get 25 numbers a little off. I need to recalculate that. But anyway, that is what I use, the guardrails, right? Just like a roller coaster or just like a train, we will adhere to ISO or we will adhere to high trust. Whether it's how we review accounts, how we baseline our laptops and endpoints, how we monitor activity and traffic that traverses the firewall, or how often we review firewall rules, what we do when it comes to supply chain and vendor assessments, vendor management, how we engage in incident, right? And conduct that life cycle. And on the engineering or software development space, what's our software development life cycle look like? How do we handle approvals and changes, change management? All these things are built into these frameworks one way or another. Sometimes the wording of the legalese is a little bit different, but this is what I use. My X factor, though, is I always connect with legal to help me translate some of the requirements. You think about like GDPR and some of those that are highly, highly wrapped in legalese. You need a good partner that will help you translate and say, well, here's a requirement, and what it actually means is X. I can then take that and say, well, we can solve that problem, or we can address that requirement with security. We can facilitate privacy with security tools, and here's how we do it.
Yeah, it really does. One thing that comes to mind as you're going through all the policy and process and laying the foundation, building the documentation, the framework of how your company is going to comply with whatever compliance that they need to. Have you experimented with any of the AI platforms in doing this? I've spoke with a number of IT leaders that have, and some have found success. Others are more skeptical. How much have you dabbled into maybe the Chat GPTs of the world or the Azure AI or some of the other ones to help in this?
Yeah, so I'll tell you this. We're currently in a phase where we are exploring artificial intelligence solutions and how they can either help us accelerate certain areas of business, help us optimize some of the operations that we have in place, or help us with accuracy and efficiency. So we're in a place where we're evaluating those right now. So that's actually where we are.
leveraging ChatGPT? I feel like I'm using it more and more for a variety of things.
Short answer is yes, right? So
Yeah.
artificial intelligence can do so many things. We have feel like we have no idea all the things it can really do. And we're probably using it in situations that are not optimized. But I have dabbled in ChatGPT personally, and I've used it to do a lot of different things, like help me build frameworks for decision making, or you can use it for different presentations, right? Maybe there's a presentation you want to deliver, and you can prompt ChatGPT and give me a presentation for a CISO who's going to the board and wants to talk to the board members about security posture, right? It's going to give you an outline, and then you can go and sprinkle Keith in it. You can go and sprinkle Darrell in it and fill in the blanks with the things that are appropriate for either what you all's posture actually is, or the things that maybe you would not have thought about to share with executive leadership or board members.
Yeah, think of the time savings of receiving those types of frameworks from ChatGPT, the outlines. That's hours. That could be hours out of your day.
To write a job description from scratch, right?
Yeah.
Totally Google your way through it. You could partner with the people team or HR, or maybe they're busy at the moment, but you just want to get an idea. Give me a job description for, I don't know, a VP of IT and security. It's going to give you something to work with from there.
That gives me an idea with everyone's busy schedules at work and it can be such a pain to bring the relevant parties into the discussion of a new technology. Some of them might think it's tertiary to their job, or it's low on their priority list, and they are already quite swamped with meetings and everyone that they're managing. I wonder if we could leverage a generative AI platform to ask it, someone in this position with these responsibilities, how would they think about this technology that we're looking to bring in? I wonder if there's some data that we could feed into a ChatGPT to give us some idea of how they would view a new technology that we're introducing into the company to just start that process. Maybe be able to meet them where they are mentally, because we're all in our own silos. We all mostly think and consider the future based on our experience. Yep. ChatGPT, keep on saying ChatGPT. I know there are others. I probably use ChatGPT the most. It might be an avenue to help us realize other perspectives and start that process.
I think that's brilliant. Someone like myself is one of my biggest challenges, meeting folks wherever they are, because we don't make these decisions or make purchases or implementations or siloed. We need to partner with either finance team, or we need to partner with engineering, or we need to partner with legal or board members to sign off and approve on certain changes, especially if we're talking major architectural expenses, right? Being able to frame those conversations or frame those topics in a way that is digestible for folks who don't have your level of visibility and understanding of the industry consequences even. That's probably one of the largest pain points for folks in my position is maybe we see a consequence. We often think breach first in closing a gap or solving a solution. We were talking about SOC as a service earlier, and being able to frame that in a way that folks understand the need, the value in executing or implementing the solution, and why we don't want to be on the wrong side of it, not having made that decision. You got to make it easy, because you usually don't have a whole lot of time. And if you explain too much, it's just going to get lost in the sauce. So maybe using generative AI to help us, frame those conversations is actually a really good idea. I'm going to experiment with that.
Words of the wise from Darrell Stinson: don't have your message become lost in the sauce. I think that's an excellent point to leave on here as we end the podcast. Darrell, this has been incredibly insightful. Where can our listeners find you if they wanted to ask any questions about your experience or maybe receive some guidance?
I am very active on LinkedIn. So it's Darrell J. Stinson, CISSP, CEH. If you type all those things in, you'll definitely find me. So I find my smiling face send me a DM, send me a connection. I'd be happy to reach back out to you.
We'll make sure to add those into the show notes. Darrell, thank you immensely for coming onto the podcast, and I certainly have appreciated the conversation.
Keith, thanks for inviting me. It was like having a conversation with a friend.
I like the sound of that. Likewise. Take care, everyone. Have an awesome rest of the day, and don't get lost in the sauce. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for listening. The IT Matters podcast is produced by Opkalla, an IT advisory firm that helps businesses navigate the vast and complex IT marketplace. Learn more about Opkalla at opkalla.com.